So here's to reiterate our starting point, as I have before, and I'm going to keep reiterating this. Same-sex relationships, as we see them, are God's calling to some people, and the way that they can live out their Christian journey and walk as human beings in this world. It's a part of God's plan for the world. So that's our starting point. So just again, a quick review. We started with Leviticus 18 and 20, and their references to same-sex intercourse, specifically in temple prostitution. So as we've seen in many of the other passages, they're not necessarily talking about the whole same-sex relationship or even relationships as a whole. They're talking about the specific action of sexual intercourse and how that often is linked with, well, in the Bible it's almost always with prostitution or rape or power imbalance when it's talking about same-sex relationships, not how we understand committed relationships. Then we talked about Peter's vision in Acts 10 and how God was reinterpreting the purity laws of Leviticus for Peter. Then we talked about the two creation stories and some of the harmful ideas of the natural order. That we say that this is the natural order that God created, and how that has been used to subjugate women, to justify slavery. It's been used to abuse children and destroy the natural world. So all of these things have happened when we've said the natural order. And then finally it's been used to alienate, isolate, and hurt individuals from the LGBTQ plus community. Then we talked about this intimate relationship between Jonathan and David, and this kind of very close, intimate same-sex relationship, one of the great love stories of the Bible, and how in that way we have a healthy version of what it means to be in same-sex relationship. And then today we're going to talk about Romans 1 verse 18 to 2 verse 11. And we're going to discuss it like in specifics on the Zoom study afterwards. So I'll put that link up in the chat so that you can join in for that. But for this one, I'm going to provide just a bit of an overview. This Romans passage section is so thick. There is so much in it, and it would take a long time to go through this. Even in the study, we'll probably have to take a few weeks. But I want to set the stage here. This Romans text is what we call a Clobber passage. It's one of those passages that's been used as a very large stick to hit people with, and literally sometimes beat them to death with. It's been that horrible. It's constantly used to kind of abuse and re-traumatize LGBTQIA2S plus individuals. And I want to point to this, that Paul's letters are abused today and have been in the past. They continue. What Paul has said has been taken and used. So we need to understand. Paul's understanding of slavery, for example, from 2,000 years ago, continues to influence how people of African American, African Canadian descent are treated to this day. So there's a passage being used that still influences Paul's view of women, right? From 2,000 years ago influences how women are treated today. And similarly, Paul's perspective on same-sex relationships, or should I say same-sex intercourse, because he doesn't talk about relationships. It directly impacts the LGBTQIA2S plus community in Prince George and around the world. I'm not going to name examples, although there are many, of how that has affected people. So Paul's view on slavery and women in leadership is no longer our view. It just isn't. We've actually said, no, Paul, this isn't our view anymore. And I believe the same thing must be said around same-sex relationships. Paul has nothing constructive to say about how we understand same-sex relationships. The only thing he talks about is same-sex intercourse, and even then it's around overpowering and abusing each other. That's the context for that. That's the context for the Romans passage. This is sort of a broad piece, right, that I want you to come at this passage with. It's easy to get caught in the specifics without seeing the broader piece. We always have to remember that Jesus is our lens, not Paul. Though the church has been significantly shaped by Paul, it is Jesus' lens that we look through. Jesus says nothing about same-sex relationships, but he talks about love, he compassion and kindness and forgiveness and judgment. And Jesus talks about taking the log out of our own eye before we try and take the splinter out of someone else's. Paul also has something to say to every one of us who have the tendency, which is all of us, to pass judgment on others. That is the primary overall piece of this text. But somehow we get stuck on this misinterpretation of sexual intercourse as the primary piece, as the center of it. So what does Paul say about judgment in this passage? Well, he starts in Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness, for those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. What Paul begins with here is a outline of them and us. And he sets it up really well. He says, there are those people out there, and they are not glorifying God. In fact, they're worshiping idols, and they're worshiping other things besides God. Basically, they've ignored God, and they should know who God is, but they've decided to ignore that. This is the first part up until verse 23. And so right away as a reader, we get quite comfortable. We're comfortable with the fact that we are the ones who are on the inside looking at the others on the outside because what? We've accepted God, right? We haven't suppressed the truth. And then Paul goes to over in 24 to say that because those other people, of course, have suppressed the truth about God, they have been given over to all of these horrible things. Right? They've been given over to them. So as a result of not acknowledging God, they've been given over to these things. And so that's where this section around same-sex intercourse comes into play. And once again, what I need to say about this is that Paul doesn't have anything constructive to say to us in terms of same-sex relationships. He just doesn't. He doesn't know what he's talking about in terms of what we are experiencing now. What he does have something to say about for us is this. They were filled with every kind of wickedness and evil and covetousness, wanting people's things, envy and murder and strife, and gossips, and slanderers, heartless and ruthless. Paul says that if you reject God, this is what you fall into. This is what you fall into. And so again, we are comfortable saying that we are not those people. And then comes the twist. Chapter 2, first verse. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourselves, because you, the judge, are doing the very same thing. So what Paul does is he makes us comfortable saying that the other is the one doing the thing, whatever that is, picking at that speck in the eye, and then suddenly he reverses it, and he says, no, guess what? You're the one doing the thing. You're the one doing the thing. Right? You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with truth. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourselves, you will escape judgment of God? Or do you despise the richness of his kindness? Paul is making a point here about judgment. He's making a point about how we are so much more likely to look at other people and judge than spending our time pulling out the log in our own eye. The reality is that if we would just spend the time on ourselves and start there, we would have very little time to sit and look at other people in judgment. And let's be honest, we have judged. And many of the reasons why the church is at where it is because we've decided that we could judge others constantly. Paul is saying, enough of that. God is good, and God is kindness, and it's time to stop with the judging.